Hey, welcome back everyone. So in today's video, I'm going to be showing a sample lesson from my newest course, Drawing Stylized Anatomy. In the previous one, I showed you how to break things down with some simplified shapes, but now in this lesson, we're going to delve into adding more volume to those shapes, which is an important factor for making your stuff look more dimensional. So let's jump on in. All right, welcome back. So another thing I wanted to point out before we move on to this. So again, you've got the strips, you've got the bent shapes that you should be working on. These again will help out with a lot more than just drawing these stylized characters. So I really suggest you do it. It's also thinking about the belly of a muscle. So you kind of have it here, but let me just draw it off to the side. So any muscle, or almost any muscle I should say, is going to have a noticeable kind of belly to it. So it's good to practice these types of shapes. You can call them teardrops. I've heard people refer to them as chicken legs, all sorts of things. But it's just kind of this belly-like form, something like this. And even practice just kind of wrapping these in front of and around each other. This is a lot of what makes the forearm really complicated to draw, because it has a lot of this. It has some smaller ones that kind of protrude out, and so you can think of them like mini little cables as well. Let me pull up there so you can see it better. These tiny little cables, but again, it's kind of a noticeable thickened area, and it's called a belly to the muscle, and you're going to see that in a lot of areas. So it's good to practice these as well. And then sometimes you're even going to see these areas wrap around another group. Do something like this. They kind of worm around. So that's something else that's worth practicing. There's times I like doing this effect with cables. So it's kind of similar to this. It's fun to practice, and all it really is, and it can come in handy for muscles as well, is you draw, let's just say, one big cable. So that we'll ignore the belly portion for now, just to show you this little exercise. We'll do these little wrapping lines. So the wrapping lines are just there to get a sense of depth and dimension. So all you do is you put a little curve on them, and that immediately gives you a little bit of a 3D kind of vibe to that, right? With hardly any effort. And then you take another one, much thinner, say, well, I'm going to bring that over here, have it wave around a little bit, so it's not just a straight cylinder, but other than that, it's a cylinder with a little bit of bend to it, and some tiny little wrapping lines, right? And just like that, without hardly any work, you put a little shadow right here, maybe a little bit over here, but definitely more noticeable on this side. Oops. Look at that. We've already got something that feels like a couple cables, and one beneath the other. I mean, immediate depth perception for very little effort, okay? And you can continue on that path, and it's really kind of a fun exploration. So I like just going with this. It's almost something to just kind of zone out and do a bunch of, and then you can play around with different variations to the wrapping lines if you want. But essentially, what I like about this the most is that it's just an immediate kind of bit of depth with very little effort. And you can keep building upon it randomly. So you can say, I'm going to curve it over to here and have this pass under these. I'm going to start with some really thin ones now. I'm going to get these nice and thin. I'm going to have them go against the current direction, because again, these are random, right? Now, with muscles, until you get to the veins, they don't really seem as random as this. Oh, you know what? And I'm kind of disjointed there. Always draw through so it's not disjointed. But it's maybe not as random as this for muscles, but this is still a very good exercise to get you thinking in that dimensional kind of way, in that interlocking kind of way, of like veins even. But again, play around with this, and then you can get to a point where you scale the brush down, and you can even do some that are just silhouettes in the background. You can use some negative lines to show the separation if you want. But you can really keep going and going, smaller and smaller, and show a little bit of variation in the wires. Stuff like this colors up really nicely too. But see how simple that idea is really? And then you can add like a little bit of rendering to, if this is a cable. But again, I really just want you to think about the idea of depth perception and overlapping forms. And then here, thinking about the belly of the muscles and, really trying to envision if one is in front of the other, what does that do? Does the belly go in front of the other? Does the other one get dwarfed by the size comparison? Does it pass beneath the next few that come up? So you'll see as we illustrate these ideas, there's going to be a lot of that. There's going to be a lot of things that move up and then overlap another object, another form. You have to think about how the shadows react there, how the line weight reacts, things like that. So practice that as well. And so back over to here, I wanted to mention one more thing before we wrap up this one, and that is basically to really envision and play around with the, remember as I talked about the strips of muscle down here, this right here, those are basically just, thin strips of muscle. And there's a lot of areas of the body where you're going to have to think about that there's a lot of thin little strips of muscle that, if you draw them too bulky, they're just going to look inflamed and ridiculous. And there's a time and a place, right? Certain muscles you're going to want to show big bulging biceps, right? That's a pretty common term. But then you wouldn't want to do that everywhere, because then what happens to the biceps? They look dwarfed by comparison. Or if you do it everywhere, it just looks like somebody that's got a really bad inflammation problem. They're all inflamed everywhere. It's they got swelling everywhere. Just wouldn't make sense. So what you have to do is, once you get to the point where we're going to keep going over these basic shapes to look for. So one of the basic shapes here, there's a diamond on the back of the separation of the muscles, the trapezius. So the trapezius comes up like this, into there. You get that diamond of separation there. They're pulling against the spine, right? So it goes like this, and then it goes up and around the spine of scapula. So the shoulder blade is somewhere like this, and it just kind of goes around that, right? So you get this bit of a shape. Now, if I was going to simplify that further for you, I'm going to try that again. I would definitely start with the diamond, because to me that's the most noticeable kind of landmark, we'll call it. And I would, if I was going very simplified, I would just do this. Okay? So it's almost like, well, let's just say with the back, there's a lot of V's and W's. We'll get into that more. Like when you draw the lat, it basically looks like a W-like shape right there. But again, we'll get into all that. But the thing I want you to focus on here is, say that you're to the point where you're like, okay, this is the simplified form of the trapezius that I've got in my mind, right? But how thick is that? So if it was consistently the same width or thickness, kind of that strip of muscle that I talked about, maybe it would look like this. Okay, so look how flat that looks all of a sudden, right? It doesn't look like a overly bulky trapezius. And I would say that's an area of the body where you would want more definition and more curvature. So again, it's not just memorizing the shape. At first, that's what you want. You want some simplified shapes. You want to convert that to memory. You want to make your own distinctions for sure. Don't trust everybody's source. Make up your own. Be inventive. Be creative. You might just come up with the next best way to explain a certain muscle group, and that's going to be your style, right? Or part of it. Well, in this case, again, that's just too flat. So the shape's not wrong. It's the perception of depth in relation to it. So now let's take the same shape. You do get a bit of a divide here. Sometimes you'll see there's more of a separation there, but I feel like just kind of implying that is enough. But what I'll do is I'll put curves here for the wrapping lines. Right? And I'll just kind of envision a little bit more depth. See how immediately we can get that to look like it's protruding away from the base form of the back. You know, it's got some real perception of depth there. And then obviously we added to that. Just take a shadow. Well, let me lighten that up even more. And I'll just put like a nice big shadow here. Now obviously it's pretty easy once you start adding in these grayscale shadows to show a lot more curvature and depth. But I just want you to get the point. Like, you need to practice these in ways where you are perceiving depth and you are using your wrapping lines to curve over, you know, so this shape of the deltoid looks really flat, right? Right here, and so to me, the deltoid is really like a heart shape. And you can see that's pretty much what I drew there, a sideways heart. Now you do have a medial head. You have a posterior head, posterior head. You have your anterior head, which you would barely see at an angle like this. Something like that. I mean, I don't know if that's exactly right, but then again, is there an exactly right? We're talking stylized anatomy. But the difference is here, I need to figure that out, where that segmentation is, where those three main muscles are. I can break off into smaller striations, but then I need to really perceive the curvature of the muscle groups. There's got to be depth and dimension there. See how that immediately looks a lot more dimensional, even without the shadows, and it's just those wrapping lines, versus something like that, where we really don't know, is that flat? Is that, what is that? It's implied a little bit, but not enough. So again, the separation, figure out where the heads of the deltoid would be. Let's say something like this. And then get in the curved wrapping lines. It's almost like you're drawing Spidey's suit or somebody, right? And there you go. Now you've got some implied depth. You can also add a little bit of grayscale to it, which will really push it out at the viewer a lot more. So you get like your shapes of shadows going. Again, we'll get into all this. I'm just trying to slowly warm you up to these concepts. And just like that, we have something that looks and feels a little more dimensional. So that's really it. And again, it's going to be practicing all these things. So focus on this. For this particular lesson, focus on the belly of the muscles, and really play around with this as well. So I probably should have showed you a little more variation to that. One more. It's not just going to be, you're going to have the belly of the muscle, and it's good to find that and pinpoint that all throughout the body. But you're going to want to show like really some variation in the way that occurs. So some are going to be, big center belly, and they're going to thin out quite a bit. Sometimes you're going to get a belly to the muscle, and the tendon's going to be a lot longer. And then again, it's going to be the variation and the overlaps to those. Sometimes they're going to pass in front of, around, through, underneath. So again, play around with the variation to that. Then also couple that with the idea of conveying thickness and weight. You can definitely use your wrapping lines. You can also use a little bit of grayscale and shadowing value, but keep it simple and practice all sorts of variations with this. And then also practice studying from life or comic art that you like, but break it down in this way and see what you come up with. So let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll head over to our next lesson.